The twin moons of Zephyria cast their pale light over the imperial capital, their glow refracted through the towering crystal spires of the Celestian Palace. Below, the grand hall of the palace pulsed with the subdued murmur of diplomatic discourse, the soft chime of crystal goblets colliding in hollow toasts, and the delicate rustle of silk and armor moving in a carefully orchestrated waltz of power. It was a celebration, at least in name. The Celestian Empire, once an indomitable force, stood at the precipice of change. For decades, they had reigned supreme, their rulers chosen from those born with the strongest light, celestials who could harness and manipulate luminous energy, bending it to their will. Their empire had expanded through sheer dominance, absorbing smaller systems, enforcing their own version of order. But no empire, no matter how mighty, remained unchallenged forever. The Galactic Alliance, an emerging federation of various species, including humanity, had proven to be a thorn in the Celestians' side. Their technology was crude compared to the Celestials' mastery over energy, but what they lacked in raw power, they made up for in strategy, numbers, and above all, persistence. The war had raged for years, stretching both factions thin, and now, at last, they sat at the same table, not as conquerors or rebels, but as diplomats forced into negotiation by necessity. The tension in the room was palpable, a current humming just beneath the surface. Every guest, from Celestian nobles draped in shimmering robes to off-world dignitaries wearing the stiff uniforms of their respective governments, knew that this was no mere feast. It was a battlefield of words, veiled threats, and unspoken deals. Each gesture calculated, each glance weighed for intent. Astrid Caelum had learned to recognize these games from an early age, though she had never been a player. Seated at the far end of the banquet hall, away from the golden light of the floating orbs that illuminated the dignitaries of true importance, she traced the rim of her untouched goblet, watching. Always watching. Astrid was Celestian by birth but not by stature. She had inherited the luminous eyes, the delicate features, but not the power that defined her people. Among a race that measured worth by the strength of their radiance, she was a dim star in a sky of burning suns. A disappointment. A shadow. Born to the imperial house, she had once been a candidate for succession, until it became clear that she lacked the brilliance required to rule. Her older brother had been the pride of the empire before his untimely death, and Astrid, his lesser, forgotten sibling, had been quietly relegated to the periphery. Not exiled, but dismissed. Present, yet invisible. She was tolerated here tonight, dressed in an elegant gown of midnight blue, a color meant to hide the fact that she barely reflected the light that her kin radiated so effortlessly. But no one engaged her. No one acknowledged her. Which was why the human caught her attention. He didn't belong here, and yet he acted as if he did. Damien Hayes sat with the air of a man who had walked into the wrong room, but decided to make himself comfortable anyway. He leaned back in his seat, broad shoulders relaxed, dark eyes scanning the room with a mix of amusement and disinterest. Unlike the Celestian nobles, who carried themselves with a predatory grace, Damien moved differently, sharper, more deliberate. He wasn't Celestian, he wasn't glowing, but somehow he was noticed. Astrid had read about him before his arrival. The Ghost of Kalos, the Alliance had nicknamed him. A strategist, with an uncanny ability to turn impossible battles into victories. A man who won wars through intellect rather than brute strength. And now, he was here, representing the Alliance in this precarious attempt at diplomacy. Their eyes met. For a fraction of a second, Astrid hesitated, caught in the quiet intensity of his gaze. Then she tilted her head slightly, acknowledging him not as an adversary, not as an ally, but as something far more dangerous, an unknown. Damien smirked, barely perceptible, before turning his attention back to his surroundings. Astrid exhaled, reaching for her goblet. "You're staring," a voice murmured beside her. She turned her head slightly, unsurprised to find Cael Voss, her cousin, smirking at her. Unlike the other Celestians, Cael possessed an irreverence that made him almost tolerable. "Am I?" she murmured, lifting the glass to her lips. Cael chuckled. "Careful, cousin. I hear humans are high maintenance. Astrid huffed a quiet laugh, but before she could respond, the room shifted. A new figure rose from the head of the table. Cassian Valor, Celestian Prince and heir apparent. His presence alone commanded attention. Where Astrid lacked brilliance, Cassian embodied it. His golden eyes gleamed under the light, his long coat embroidered with threads that shimmered like the surface of a sun. He was power and privilege wrapped in a perfect package of arrogance. He raised his goblet, addressing the gathered assembly. "Tonight, we celebrate a new possibility," he declared. "A future where war no longer binds us. A future of cooperation." A ripple of polite applause followed. Astrid remained still, watching the way Cassian's gaze flickered toward Damien, measuring him. "But let us not be naive," Cassian continued, his tone shifting subtly. "Cooperation is built on trust, and trust is a fragile thing, is it not?" Damien smirked, lifting his own goblet lazily. "Oh, I agree," he said. "But trust is also negotiable." A murmur spread through the hall. Astrid felt the tension rise another degree. This was the game, she realized. A contest of control, disguised as civility. Cassian's gaze flickered toward her then, as if only just now noticing her presence. "Speaking of trust," he mused, "it seems some of us have little experience with it." A pause, a calculated silence. Astrid knew what was coming before he said it. "Tell me, princess," Cassian said, voice dripping with false sweetness. "What do you think of this alliance? Do you believe in the strength of outsiders? A challenge. A public test." The room stilled, all eyes turning toward her. Astrid set her goblet down carefully. "That depends," she said, meeting Cassian's gaze with unwavering calm. "Do you?" For the briefest moment, something sharp flickered in his eyes. Then Damien laughed. Not a quiet chuckle, but an actual, full-bodied, amused laugh that shattered the silence. Astrid turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze once more. "This is the best negotiation I've been to in years," Damien mused, taking a sip of his drink. "I can't wait to see how it plays out." Astrid almost smiled. Almost. Because something told her that before the night was over, this alliance, this fragile, dangerous peace, would become far more personal than either of them had intended, and neither of them would walk away unchanged. The hum of conversation in the banquet hall never truly faded, not even as golden goblets clinked and polished silverware scraped against the delicate porcelain of Celestian-crafted dishes. Every exchange was carefully measured, every smile masking quiet calculations. The Celestians did nothing without purpose, and tonight was no different. This was not a celebration, it was a performance. Astrid had expected to endure the evening in relative silence. She had long since perfected the art of being unseen, of existing on the fringes without calling attention to herself. But as she sat at the long imperial table, listening to the polite, razor-edged diplomacy unfold, she felt an unsettling shift in the air, an undercurrent of something more volatile beneath the layers of civility. Then, Cassian Valor rose to his feet. The heir to the Celestian throne had always carried himself with an air of effortless superiority, his golden eyes gleaming with the arrogance that came from knowing he was destined for power. He was beautiful in the way that all Celestians were, statuesque, radiant, an embodiment of their empire's ideals. He had once been a fixture of Astrid's life, a reminder of everything she was not. He smiled now, slow and deliberate, as he raised his goblet toward the assembled guests. The hall quieted, waiting. "A toast," he said smoothly, his voice carrying effortlessly. "To our honored guests from the Galactic Alliance. May this evening mark the beginning of a future where we no longer see one another as adversaries." The expected murmur of approval rippled through the room. Astrid did not move. She knew Cassian too well to believe his words were anything but a prelude to something sharper. His gaze flickered toward Damien Hayes, the lone human among them, the outsider who had somehow managed to command attention without effort. Cassian's expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way he regarded Damien that unsettled her. "And of course," Cassian continued, "let us not forget the importance of strong alliances. The bonds we form here tonight will shape the path forward. After all, what is an empire without unity? Without legacy? There it was. The shift in tone. The sharpened edge hidden beneath the silk of his words. Astrid felt the weight of expectations settle over her before Cassian even turned to her. But some, he mused, are simply not meant to be part of that legacy. Silence. Subtle, but deafening. Astrid felt the attention in the room tilt, the invisible weight of judgment settling onto her shoulders like a shroud. Cassian's smile did not falter. "Tell me, princess," he said, feigning curiosity. "What must it be like to stand in the presence of those who actually belong at this table?" The words were a dagger, slid effortlessly between the ribs, not because they were unexpected, but because they were designed to draw blood where it would hurt most. A flicker of movement caught her eye. Across the table, Damien's relaxed posture had shifted, just slightly. His fingers drummed once against the surface of the polished wood, a quiet, thoughtful rhythm. Astrid could not afford to react, but she felt the familiar sting of humiliation coil in her chest, felt the pressure of waiting eyes, gauging her worth in real time. Cassian had set the stage for mockery, and the court was all too willing to play its part. Cassian leaned forward, as if sharing a great secret. "You see, gentlemen," he continued, addressing the assembled Celestian nobility, "our honored guests may not be familiar with the traditions of our people. Allow me to enlighten them." Astrid's hands curled into fists beneath the table. "In our great empire, lineage is paramount," Cassian said, his voice a gentle lull that barely concealed its venom. "Strength determines status, legacy determines worth. And to cement such things, a Celestian of noble blood must be claimed before the court, a bond recognized by all, unbreakable, undeniable." He paused, then turned fully to Astrid, his eyes glinting with the satisfaction of a man delivering a killing blow. "But some," he said, smiling, "are simply unworthy of being claimed at all." Laughter rippled through the hall, a wave of quiet amusement that cut through Astrid like ice. It was not the first time she had been humiliated in front of the court. It would not be the last. But for the first time, she was not alone at this table. Damien's voice broke the moment like the crack of a distant storm. "That's funny." The laughter stilled. Astrid inhaled sharply. Damien was smiling, but there was something razor-sharp in it, something cold and measured. He tilted his head, regarding Cassian as one might observe an insect beneath their boot. "Forgive me, Your Highness," Damien said, lazily swirling the drink in his glass. "But I have to ask, what exactly makes you think your opinion determines someone else's worth?" A flicker of surprise crossed Cassian's face, so fleeting that it might have been imagined. Damien set his glass down, the soft clink unnervingly loud in the quiet. "Because from where I'm sitting," he continued, "I don't see a woman unworthy of being claimed. I see a room full of people too blind to recognize what's in front of them." A murmur of discontent rippled through the court. Astrid's breath caught in her throat. Damien exhaled, shaking his head. "You Celestians, always so obsessed with status, with purity, with legacy." He leaned forward, bracing his forearms against the table. "But legacies aren't built on words. They're built on action." Cassian's expression cooled. "And what, pray tell, are you suggesting?" A heartbeat of silence. Then Damien smiled, slow and deliberate. "Then I swear upon the stars themselves." The words rang through the hall like a shot fired into the void. Every movement stilled. Every breath caught. A suffocating silence followed, so thick it pressed against the skin. Astrid barely registered the moment she pushed back her chair, barely felt the floor beneath her feet as she turned to him, heart hammering against her ribs. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" she whispered, voice low, urgent. Damien didn't waver. He simply met her gaze, dark eyes unreadable, a flicker of something indiscernible lurking beneath them. "I think," he murmured, "I just saved you from a pompous bastard." Chaos erupted. Nobles surged to their feet, voices overlapping in a storm of disbelief. Someone knocked over a goblet. Someone else gasped loud enough to echo through the hall. Astrid barely heard any of it, because Cassian's smirk had vanished, replaced by something far darker. Because her father, the Emperor, was watching the scene unfold with interest, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Because Damien had just invoked an oath that could not be undone. And now there was no turning back. The grand banquet hall of the Celestian Palace shimmered with the radiance of 1,000 floating lights, their glow refracted through towering crystal pillars that lined the vast room. Every detail of the evening had been meticulously curated, glittering chandeliers casting a golden hue over flowing silk robes, the soft clinking of glassware as nobles whispered behind jeweled masks, the delicate notes of a string quartet weaving through the air like threads of an elaborate illusion. Everything was polished, refined, immaculate. And yet beneath the veneer of civility, the tension was thick enough to cut. Seated at the very end of the banquet table, far from the Emperor's throne and the honored dignitaries, Astrid Caelum let her fingers glide absently along the rim of her untouched goblet. Her seat was a statement in itself, a silent decree that she was present but irrelevant. Celestian tradition dictated that placement at the imperial table reflected one's status, and hers, pushed to the very edge of the festivities, spoke volumes. She was, as always, a shadow among the luminous. Draped in a gown of deep celestial blue, her figure was poised, her expression unreadable, but she knew how the others saw her. Among a race that valued power as the ultimate measure of worth, Astrid was an anomaly, born of royal blood but lacking the brilliance of her kin. The Celestians wielded light as both weapon and birthright, their very presence glowing with the sheer force of their lineage. Astrid, however, had been born dim. It had not mattered that she was intelligent, strategic, or far more attuned to the political games of the court than most. In the eyes of the Empire, she was incomplete. She had long since learned to embrace the quiet of insignificance. It gave her a vantage point, an ability to observe without being noticed, which was why she noticed him first. Across the hall, seated with the other foreign representatives, Damien Hayes exuded an air of effortless defiance. He did not possess the ethereal glow of the Celestians, nor did he seem to care. Unlike the other diplomats, who clung to their formalities and measured words, Damien sat in his chair with the ease of a man who had spent his life walking into places he was not welcome and making himself comfortable anyway. He was not adorned in opulence like the Celestians, nor did he carry himself with the arrogant refinement of the imperial court. His attire was practical, dark, fitted, meant for movement rather than ceremony. He was broad-shouldered and scarred, the evidence of battles fought and survived etched into his skin. But it was his eyes that drew Astrid's attention. They were sharp, calculating, unapologetically present. He was assessing the room, not with the detached curiosity of an outsider, but with the precision of a strategist taking stock of a battlefield. Where others saw grandeur, he saw vulnerabilities. Where others whispered empty pleasantries, he studied intent. And then, as if sensing her gaze, he turned. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. Astrid did not look away. Neither did he. A slow, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of Damien's lips, a quiet acknowledgement of something neither of them had yet spoken aloud. Amusement flickered in his expression. Not mockery, but something else, something sharper, a recognition. She had not expected that, and she found to her own surprise that she was intrigued. "You're staring," a voice murmured beside her. She blinked, turning to find Cale Voss watching her with a knowing grin. Her cousin, one of the few in the court who did not treat her as an afterthought, sipped leisurely from his glass, violet eyes glinting with mischief. "Am I?" she asked, lifting her goblet in feigned disinterest. Kyle chuckled. "Careful, cousin. I hear humans have a habit of disrupting things they don't understand." Astrid tilted her head slightly, gaze flicking back to Damien. Maybe that's what makes them interesting. Before Cale could respond, the air in the room shifted. Cassian Valor had risen from his seat. The hall quieted in waves as the heir to the Celestian throne commanded the attention of every noble, every diplomat, every guest present. He was a figure sculpted for dominance, tall, radiant, draped in deep crimson, lined with gold. his very presence a reminder of why he stood at the apex of Celestian hierarchy. His expression was the picture of benevolence, a smile that did not quite reach his golden eyes as he lifted his goblet. "A toast," Cassian declared, his voice smooth as polished glass. "To the future of our great empire, to the possibilities that lie ahead." Murmurs of approval rippled through the room, glasses raised in agreement. But Astrid knew Cassian well. She knew the pauses he allowed, the deliberate way he let his words linger just long enough for his true intent to unfold. And then, as if he had only just noticed her presence, Cassian's gaze flickered toward her. Astrid felt it before he even spoke. The inevitable blow, the carefully crafted spectacle meant to remind her of her place. "Of course," Cassian mused. "Not all futures are built equally, are they?" The shift in the room was subtle but unmistakable. A quiet tension, an unspoken invitation for amusement. Astrid kept her expression neutral. Cassian's smile was polite. "It is an interesting thought," he continued, voice laced with mock curiosity. "What determines one's worth in the grand design of the Empire? Is it power, legacy, or is it merely circumstance?" There was no need for translation. The message was clear. Astrid felt the weight of the court's collective gaze settle upon her, waiting, anticipating. "After all," Cassian continued, tilting his goblet slightly, "if legacy alone determined worth, then surely all born of royal blood would be equally valued. And yet—" Astrid's grip tightened around her glass. The silence that followed was the worst part, the careful, measured quiet of nobles too refined to laugh openly, but eager to witness humiliation nonetheless. Cassian took a sip from his goblet, as if savoring the moment. "It seems some are simply not meant to carry the light of the Empire forward." A sharp clink broke the stillness. Astrid barely had time to register the movement before she saw him. Damien Hayes, who had been content to observe in silence until now, had set his glass down with deliberate precision. His expression was unreadable, but the amusement that had once played at the corners of his lips was gone. Cassian turned slightly, as if finally acknowledging his presence. "Ah, our honored guest," he mused. "Forgive me. I seem to have wandered into more delicate topics." Damien leaned back slightly, studying him. Then, in a voice that carried just enough weight to cut through the noise of the hall, he said, "No, please! By all means, keep going." Cassian's smile flickered, and for the first time that evening, Astrid felt something shift, not in the balance of power, but in something far more dangerous. The game had just changed. The air inside the Celestian dueling chamber was thick with tension. Unlike the grand banquet hall, where words had been the primary weapons, this arena had been designed for something far more primal. Towering crystalline arches lined the perimeter, refracting the golden glow of suspended orbs that cast shifting patterns of light across the smooth, polished floor. The walls were adorned with banners bearing the sigils of noble houses, a silent testament to centuries of combat, honor, and conquest. Tonight, however, the audience was far from silent. The challenge had been issued the moment Damien spoke those fateful words, the moment he unknowingly bound himself to Astrid with an oath he had not fully understood. Now, he stood at the center of a tradition far older than any alliance, facing a warrior bred for battle, for dominance. Caelum stood opposite him, his posture exuding effortless confidence. Unlike the other Celestian nobles, whose radiance was ornamental, Caelum's glow pulsed with controlled power, his very presence a reminder of why Celestians were feared across the stars. He did not need ceremonial armor or elaborate robes. His simple, form-fitting tunic bore the insignia of his house, and the way he carried himself spoke of victories hard-earned. His golden eyes gleamed under the ethereal light, focused, expectant. Damien knew that look well. He had seen it before, across countless battlefields, in the eyes of soldiers who had never lost and did not believe they could. He flexed his fingers, rolling his shoulders as he studied his opponent. He was not a Celestian. He had no divine light coursing through his veins, no ability to move faster than the eye could follow, or summon energy from the stars themselves. He had nothing but his own body, his instincts, and the hard-won knowledge that brute strength alone did not win wars. The duel began without ceremony. Cael moved first. A flicker, then a burst of motion. So fast that Damien barely had time to register the shift before Cael was upon him. The Celestian's speed was unnatural, his form a blur of gold and shadow as he closed the distance in the blink of an eye. Damien twisted, barely dodging the strike that followed, a fist aimed with precision at his ribs. Even with the near miss, the air pressure from the blow sent a sharp sting across his side. Too fast, too strong. He could not afford a direct confrontation. Cael did not pause, pressing the attack, his movements fluid, relentless. He fought with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged, his strikes precise, economical. Damien blocked where he could, dodged where he couldn't, each step a careful calculation. He was not faster, he was not stronger, but he was smarter. Cael fought like a warrior trained within the controlled environment of Celestian combat schools, where battles were fought with honor, with structure. He expected Damien to respond in kind, to parry, to counter in a way that followed the rules of engagement he had spent his life mastering. Damien had never cared much for rules. When the next strike came, Damien didn't try to meet it. Instead, he stepped inside the attack, into the space Cael had left unguarded, and with a calculated shift of weight, drove his elbow hard into the Celestian's side. Cael staggered, not from pain, but from surprise. The moment of hesitation was all Damien needed. He dropped low, sweeping a leg behind Cael's knee and yanking forward with just enough force to send the Celestian off balance. Cael stumbled, his controlled grace momentarily broken, and Damien capitalized. He pivoted, catching Cael's arm and twisting with practiced precision, using the momentum of his own stumble against him. The Celestian crashed onto the polished floor. Gasps rippled through the gathered onlookers. It had happened too quickly for them to process, too impossibly fast for them to believe. A human, a man with no Celestian gifts, had just sent a trained warrior to the ground. Damien straightened, rolling his shoulders as Cael pushed himself up, his expression no longer amused but something colder, more calculating. This was where it would get dangerous. Cael had underestimated him. That would not happen again. Damien braced himself, preparing for the renewed assault, but Cael did not immediately move. Instead, he exhaled, and the golden light around him flared. The floor beneath Damien's feet vibrated. He had known Cael was strong. He had not known he could do this. Light burst outward from Cael's palms, not in a blinding flare, but as concentrated energy coiled around his limbs, fueling his next strike. He moved, faster than before, his form flickering between solid and luminous, as he became the very force that Celestians were known for. Damien barely ducked in time as Cael's hand sliced through the space his head had occupied a second earlier. The power behind the strike left a faint scorch in the air, heat radiating from Cael's fingertips. Adaptation. That was the key. Cael was relying on his power, on the assumption that raw energy and speed would overwhelm Damien's lesser form. But power had weaknesses. Power was predictable. Damien baited him. He shifted his stance, body angling just enough to feign an opening, a weakness too tempting to ignore. Cael lunged, and in that instant, Damien moved first. Not backward. Forward. He stepped inside the attack again, into the space where Cael's speed worked against him. He caught Cael's wrist mid-swing, twisting sharply, redirecting the force. The Celestian's own momentum carried him forward, straight into Damien's waiting knee. The impact sent Cael sprawling. This time, he did not immediately rise. The hall was silent. Damien exhaled, stepping back as Cael slowly pushed himself up, his golden eyes no longer filled with easy confidence. He looked at Damien, not with the disdain of a warrior who had dismissed an inferior opponent, but with something new, something dangerous. Respect. And then, Cael did something that sent another ripple of shock through the court. He inclined his head. Not a bow, not submission, but acknowledgement. The duel had ended. Damien knew better than to let relief settle. He could feel the weight of 100 eyes on him, the shifting tension in the room, the way everything had changed in the span of a few heartbeats. This had never been just about a fight. It had been a statement. And whether he had intended to or not, Damien Hayes had just made himself impossible to ignore. The aftermath of the duel rippled through the palace like a silent explosion, one that carried far beyond the crystal walls of the Celestian court. What had begun as a spectacle of amusement, a test meant to put Damien Hayes in his place, had turned into something far more disruptive. The human had not only held his own against Cael Voss, but he had won. And worse, he had done it in a way that Celestians could not easily dismiss. Word spread at light speed. By the time Damien left the dueling chamber, the news had already reached the farthest corners of the Empire. The Galactic Alliance's envoy had bested a Celestian warrior. A man with no divine light had humbled a noble. And most scandalous of all, he had done so after invoking a binding oath with a princess of royal blood. Inside the great halls of the palace, the nobility erupted into hushed debates, voices hushed but urgent. Some scoffed at the absurdity of it. A human, a species viewed as physically inferior, had dared to claim a Celestian princess, a being of flesh and bone among those who wielded light itself. It was laughable, except that it was not, because Damien had proven that power was not always inborn, and that terrified them. The court divided almost instantly. The traditionalists, those who viewed Celestian purity as absolute, saw the event as an abomination, a threat to the sanctity of their customs. To them, Damien was not just an outsider. He was a crack in the foundation of their rule, an example that the rigid structures they clung to might not be as unshakable as they believed. If a human could challenge their strength, what else could be questioned? But others, particularly those who had long grown weary of the Empire's obsession with bloodlines and power, whispered in private circles. Perhaps it was time for change. Perhaps this alliance, forged by chance, could mean something more. And at the center of it all, Astrid Caelum found herself no longer invisible. For the first time in her life, people were speaking her name. Not as a forgotten daughter, not as a weak-blooded anomaly, but as a pivot point in a conflict that could reshape the Empire. It was an unfamiliar feeling, being seen. But visibility, she knew, was a dangerous thing. She had spent her life knowing that her presence was tolerated, not valued. That her father, Emperor Zephyrus, had long ago stopped expecting anything of her. But now, she was at the heart of something larger than herself. Something that could shift the future of the Empire. And her father had noticed. When the summons came, she was not surprised. The imperial throne room was colder than the rest of the palace, the crystalline walls amplifying the flickering light from the high chandeliers, making the entire space seem suspended between reality and something ethereal. Her father sat upon the high throne, flanked by advisors whose faces betrayed nothing. His presence was not one of outward aggression, nor of warmth. He was a figure of absolute control, a ruler who had never needed to raise his voice to command obedience. Damien stood before him, as unshaken as he had been before the duel. He met the Emperor's gaze without flinching, his posture steady. Not defiant, not submissive. Just unapologetically present. A quiet tension stretched between them, unspoken, but heavy. Then, the Emperor spoke. "You have disrupted the order of my court." The words were not angry, nor were they approving. They were simply fact. Damien inclined his head slightly. "That was not my intention, Your Majesty." A pause. But it was the result. The Emperor studied him, his golden eyes unreadable. Then his gaze flickered to Astrid, as if weighing something unseen. "The bond you have invoked cannot be undone without consequence," he said finally. "But an oath alone does not make you worthy of it." Astrid stiffened. Damien, however, did not waver. The Emperor leaned forward, his expression calm. "If you mean to stand by the words you spoke, you will prove it. Before this court. Before the Empire." The challenge was unmistakable. And Damien, after the barest pause, smiled. "As you wish." The night air on Zephyria carried a sharp chill, the kind that settled in the bones rather than the skin. The grand halls of the palace had long since emptied of its guests, but the weight of the evening still lingered, a ghost of whispered conversations and unspoken calculations. Astrid Caelum walked through the quiet corridors with slow, measured steps, her mind a battlefield of conflicted thoughts. She had spent years being invisible, and now, suddenly, she was at the center of everything. She wasn't naive enough to believe that Damien had spoken those words for her sake. Whatever had driven him to challenge Cassian, to invoke an oath that could not be undone, it had not been because he saw her as anything more than a means to an end. Perhaps it had been instinct, a reaction to an injustice he couldn't ignore. Or perhaps he had simply enjoyed watching Cassian's carefully constructed world fracture for a moment. But it had changed everything. She had expected him to resent it, to look for a way out, to distance himself from the tangled mess he had willingly walked into. Yet in the hours since the duel, Damien had not once acted as though he regretted what he had done. He had not flinched under the scrutiny of the court, nor had he sought to shift the blame onto her. And that, more than anything, unsettled her. She found him on one of the palace's high balconies, standing near the edge, looking out over the vast city below. The glow of Zephyrria's twin moons bathed the skyline in silver, the towering crystalline spires reflecting light like shattered stars. He didn't turn when she approached, though she knew he had heard her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice carrying the same quiet ease it always did. Astrid leaned against the railing beside him, staring out at the view rather than at him. "I could ask you the same." Damien exhaled a soft chuckle. "I have a feeling my presence here has made sleep a rare commodity for a lot of people." It was true. The court was still in uproar. The whispers would not die easily. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye, studying the way he stood, relaxed but not careless. He was always aware of his surroundings, always watching. Even now, she could tell he was analyzing everything, calculating his next move. And yet, for all his sharp edges, he didn't seem to be wearing armor in this moment. "You don't seem particularly concerned," she observed. He turned his head slightly, looking at her. "Should I be?" Astrid hesitated, considering. Then, she sighed. "You don't know this court like I do. They'll find ways to test you, to make you regret this." Damien smirked. "They can try." She shook her head. "You think this is just another battle. It isn't. Isn't it?" His gaze was steady, unreadable. "There's a battlefield here, same as any other. The weapons are just different." He wasn't wrong. The Celestian court fought with words instead of swords, but the wounds they inflicted were just as deep. She studied him for a long moment, then asked, "Why did you do it?" He didn't pretend not to understand what she meant. At first he said nothing. His fingers tapped idly against the railing, his expression thoughtful. Then, with a slow breath, he said, "Because someone needed to." She frowned. "That's not an answer." Damien turned fully toward her, his eyes dark under the glow of the moons. "No, it's just not the one you were expecting." Astrid didn't look away. She had spent years believing that no one would ever choose her, that no one would ever look at her and see anything worth claiming, worth standing beside. And now, here was a man, an outsider, a soldier from a species Celestians had dismissed as lesser, who had stood before the Empire and spoken words that could not be undone. Not because he had to, but because he had chosen to. She didn't know what to do with that. Damien tilted his head slightly. "You don't trust me." Astrid sighed. "I don't trust anyone in this palace." A beat of silence. Then to her surprise, Damien grinned. "Good, you shouldn't." She huffed a quiet laugh. For the first time that night, the tension in her chest loosened, just a little. They stood in silence for a while, the weight of the evening settling between them. Astrid traced patterns against the smooth railing, lost in thought. She didn't know what the future held now. She didn't know if Damien would be able to stand against the forces that would move against him. But in this moment, with the city stretching endlessly before them, she knew one thing. He wasn't running, and neither was she. "I never thought I'd be bound to someone because of a celestial oath," Damien mused, his voice light but carrying something deeper beneath it. Astrid glanced at him, then looked back at the sky. "I never thought," she admitted quietly, "that anyone would actually choose me." Damien didn't answer right away. Then, with quiet certainty, he said, "Maybe that's their mistake." She didn't know what to say to that. So she said nothing at all. The attack came without warning. One moment, the palace halls were quiet. The only sounds the distant murmur of late-night political discussions and the soft hum of energy lanterns casting golden light along the corridors. The next, the air shattered with an explosion, a deep concussive force that sent a shockwave rippling through the ancient crystalline walls. Damien moved before his mind had fully processed what was happening. Years of battle instincts kicked in, his body reacting faster than thought. He grabbed Astrid's wrist, pulling her sharply to the side just as a second blast struck the hallway behind them. A shower of shattered crystal and debris rained down where they had been standing moments before. Shouts echoed through the palace, boots pounding against stone as guards rushed to secure the area. But Damien knew before he even turned that they weren't prepared for this. This wasn't just another political maneuver or veiled threat whispered behind jeweled masks. This was an execution attempt. And Astrid was the target. A shadow moved ahead, a figure clad in obsidian armor, its form sleek and unnaturally fast. Damien barely had time to register the weapon in its hand before it lunged. He shoved Astrid behind him, meeting the attack mid-strike, the impact sending a jarring shock through his bones. The assailant was strong, too strong. He twisted, using the momentum to deflect the next blow, but there was more than one enemy. Another figure moved in from the side, and Damien had just enough time to see the arc of a blade before he knew he wouldn't be fast enough. Then came the light. It wasn't the golden glow of the palace or the controlled luminescence of the Celestian nobles. This light was different, raw, untamed, burning like a star newly born. It erupted in a blinding arc, slamming into the attacking figure with the force of a collapsing sun. The assassin was thrown back, crashing into the far wall with a sickening crunch. Damien turned, heart hammering, to find Astrid standing rigid, her hands still raised, breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The air around her shimmered, as if reality itself was bending beneath the weight of what she had just done. She looked just as shocked as he was. The corridor was eerily silent in the wake of her attack, the only sound the distant ringing in his ears. Slowly, as if afraid to move too suddenly, Astrid lowered her hand. Damien exhaled, a slow grin pulling at the corner of his lips. "Well," he muttered, "that's new." Astrid blinked, her expression somewhere between disbelief and dawning realization. "I didn't—" She swallowed hard. "I didn't know I could do that." Neither did they. Damien gestured to the fallen assassins, one of whom was still groaning weakly on the ground. "Pretty sure that was the first and last time they underestimated you." Astrid let out a breathless laugh, though it was tinged with shock. Her hands were still trembling. Damien took a step closer, his voice softer now. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though it wasn't entirely convincing. "We should go," she said instead. "There might be more." He didn't argue. They moved quickly, navigating through the palace corridors as alarms rang in the distance. The attack had been planned. It hadn't been reckless or desperate. Whoever had sent those assassins had known exactly where Astrid would be, and they had expected to succeed. Damien clenched his jaw. They wouldn't make that mistake again. By the time they reached the outer courtyard, the worst of the chaos had subsided. The guards had secured the immediate area, and Celestian officials were already weaving damage control narratives, ensuring the court did not descend into full-blown panic. Astrid exhaled heavily as they stepped into the open air. Above them, the sky stretched endless and infinite, the stars piercingly bright against the dark canvas of night. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Astrid, still catching her breath, looked up at the sky. "We survived," she murmured, as if saying it aloud would make it feel real. Damien glanced at her, watching the way the moonlight caught the edges of her features, the way her expression flickered between exhaustion and something deeper. "Yeah," he said, his voice quieter now. "And I don't regret the oath anymore." Astrid turned her head slightly, searching his face for something she couldn't quite name. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then, finally, she smiled, Across the galaxies, across time itself. You've found your way here. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far across the universe our community reaches. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's episode will take you even deeper into the unknown. You won't want to miss it.